It's about time you have an easier, more efficient way to get caught up on the news. The Newsworthy breaks down the day's top stories in less than 15 minutes and gives you some lighter conversation starters along the way. Search The Newsworthy wherever you're listening now and follow or subscribe to The Newsworthy today.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Wilton, joined by Sergeant Wilton. Glenn, how are you?
I'm excellent.
It's really an interesting concept when I hear people talk about their spiritual beliefs and the work that they do and how the work that they do has completely changed the way that they feel about God, the way that they feel about faith. And I just thought that that is a topic that we can touch on a little bit today.
Yeah, it's something that it's funny, especially more recently. It's a conversation that we've had like on almost, it seems like on being a regular basis, because of you start seeing people not change their beliefs, but leaning so much into it and using it as a coping mechanism in a lot of ways.
Yesterday, I had a few messages from people who were sending me pictures of all of the chemtrails going on in our Southern California skies. And we also noticed it nearly first thing in the morning. But the thing that was quite unique about it this time is that we have never seen it in as abundance as it was. And when the night came and the sun was setting, you and I were out back with the horse and we looked up into the sky and it was just the most magnificent colors that I've ever seen before. And in addition to that, we saw some of those sun rainbows and things that you and I were discussing that we've never seen as a child. And so I'm pointing that out because something I said to you is that I wish we could say this was God's creation, but the truth is it was us. And so I think that a lot of the times we have these external things that shift how we might feel or believe in certain things.
Yeah, I think with especially like how it was so bizarre because like when we were out with the horse, the sun was setting, but it seemed like it was getting brighter out and the colors were becoming more and more vibrant. It was very strange. And like one of the comments I made to you was like, I've never recognized this, especially even when I was a kid and I lived with my head in the clouds like all the time. And when we start breaking it down and you notice these changes and, you know, we start looking at it as like, oh, look at, you know, God's creation, look what he's done. And it's in all reality, like, yes, God has a hand in everything that happens in this world. But when you start breaking it down, it's a lot of this is that cause and effect with human reaction to things too.
I remember one of my mom's family members, it seemed like every other month my mom had a new cousin, so I don't even know the relation, but I do remember seeing this individual in person and online several times, and she was an incredibly faithful woman, and her husband died, and it was just fascinating to see the way that grief and for her situation and the way that he died, how trauma can shift your beliefs. And I think the same is to be said when it comes to how, depending on what you do for work, can also change how you see suffering and justice and humanity. And for some people, your relationship with God can feel even unfamiliar.
Yeah, and I think when we start looking, I mean, we see the movies or we've gone through these life experiences, especially being a first responder. You see the worst of the world on a regular basis. And especially from a religious mindset, you say, how could God do something like this? How could, you know, these are good people. Why are they having to go through this? And then from the religious aspect, you hear people say, well, God will never give you something that you can't handle. And it's a whole rabbit hole we could go down and really look at the cause and effect with anything and everything in it. But in all reality, it comes down to our own emotional response to that trauma.
The psychological concept here is called spiritual disillusionment, and it occurs when life experiences basically challenge anything that you previously held when it comes to your beliefs. And I think a lot of time this can create tension between faith and reality. For first responders in particular, I think exposure to trauma and moral injury can lead to doubt and emotional withdrawal from your spiritual practices. I've seen that happen time and time again, or even questioning God's presence without fully abandoning your faith.
And so, like, I'm specifically thinking of an incident where in my career where, like, I went to, and I've said this numerous times to people. I was like, well, that was probably the most fun I've ever had in my career. And it was a traumatic incident for a lot of people, and it was a horrific incident, but it's also what we sign up for. It's like what we work to do to be able to respond to. And I made that mention in a class one time, and the instructor looked at me, and you could see almost a physiological impact on her when I made that statement. And from that point on, she like completely avoided me like I was a plague to this earth.
You skipped over what the situation was, so it's hard to understand the context.
So
briefly.
It was a very big incident in the city to where it was like a terrorist attack, and there was a huge response to it from a whole bunch of allied agencies and stuff, to where we responded and helped a lot of people, and then also were able to get the resolution to the case in the same day.
So I'm guessing that given the tone of the room, everybody's sharing the sensitivity of that incident, and you show up and basically say like, well, this is what we live for?
Actually, most of the officers who were actually at that incident in that same class as me had the same kind of mindset that I did. And we're not looking at this is a traumatic incident, this is hard, this is horrible. It was, you saw that shift only in the instructor that was like, what the hell just happened here?
What was her shock about?
Just in my response to, this was probably the most fun I've ever had in my career, because I wasn't looking at it as like, so many people died and there was so much bad stuff that went on. And this person specifically didn't even go into the scene on either side, and they were at the command post the entire time and never were exposed to anything that actually occurred. So they had like the secondhand trauma, not the being involved in the specific incident in itself.
Yeah. So for those that are like more emotionally in tune during that particular situation, I think that they might, if they're experiencing trauma in a different way and they're challenging their faith, they might find difficulty reconciling suffering with belief. So maybe that was something that was coming up for that individual, where that disconnect was. I've even seen people maybe be angry or confused or even silent toward God. Maybe you feel disconnected during prayer or worship, where it feels methodical and like you're just checking off a list, for example. And I think a lot of times too, especially as a first responder, some people might question the meaning or the purpose after difficult calls.
And that's where it's so important, and we've talked about this a lot, is that debriefing afterwards and having that check-in, and then being able to, especially from the supervisor side, but I think it should be across the board at all ranks, is knowing your partners, knowing their responses towards situations, to where you can talk with them, you can be there, and you can ask those questions to each and every person to find out what they're holding on to at that time.
You know what else is really interesting is some people, so I've seen, they are experiencing and exhibiting signs that faith feels distant. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be that you're questioning or challenging God, because I've seen people that's their entire world. And even people that might work in the church, for example. And so for some people, they even avoid certain questions about God, regardless of whether or not you're questioning your faith.
Yeah, and it's because they start dancing around those topics because, one, maybe you don't know the answer to it, or two, you don't want to see the truths with those answers.
And I think that it's important that if this is something important to you, that we learn ways to rebuild trust without forcing our faith. We can normalize that faith evolves through experience, which is absolutely the truth, and growth often includes questioning, and that's a great thing. And questioning and really deep thinking is a lot different than being passive and just dismissing those questions that come up. And it's important to allow honest conversations with God, because authenticity is what's going to help to be able to build that connection. And we think we have to have an answer for everything. And sometimes, for me, there have been many times where I have prayed and I haven't said anything. It's literally like I feel like I'm projecting a sense of feeling out. And so something like that's a little bit more gentle in terms of a spiritual practice, is a small step to be able to restore connection.
Yeah, and finding those connections that work for you is really, it changes for person to person, and that's where there's not a set way of this is how you have to do it. Yes, there's the learned ways of doing it, but there's not a set way and this is right and this is wrong.
I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below, and as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.